Evelyn Carter had long since stopped counting the winters since her husband died, but this one bit harder than most. Snow piled against her cabin like a second skin. She lived in a clearing where trees bent in the wind like grieving widows themselves, and every morning she tended to the same chores: woodpile, chickens, stew, until one night shattered the quiet. Her husband, Josiah, had died 3 years ago in a cave-in at the Dominion Ridge gold mine, but the rumors that he had hidden a fortune before the collapse never stopped. Men had asked questions before, polite enough, but this time they came with guns. Clay Maddox wasn't a man interested in conversation, and he didn't need to knock. He kicked down the cabin door with 3 men behind him, rifles ready, demanding to know where Josiah's gold was buried. Evelyn, in her nightdress and barefoot in the snow, refused to give them anything, even when they broke furniture and tore through cupboards. When she spat in Clay's face, he struck her so hard she saw stars, then tossed her like a rag doll onto a waiting horse. The cold bit into her skin as the men rode north into the mountains, dragging her behind like stolen goods. Evelyn bit her tongue to stay conscious, memorizing their direction even as the pain throbbed in her ribs. Behind them, her cabin smoked gently in the dark, the only warmth in the forest swallowed by night. Boone McCallister had been trailing elk through those same hills when he spotted the smoke the next morning, thin and silver against the sky. He wasn't the sort to involve himself in other people's problems, but something about the shape of that smoke, it was wrong. Years of bounty work had taught him how to read signs, and this one screamed trouble. He found the doors swinging, blood on the floor, and Evelyn's family Bible open on the table, pages torn. He could see boot prints, 4 men, 1 woman, 1 horse dragging something. That was all Boone needed. He didn't know who she was yet, only that someone had taken a woman from this place, and he couldn't leave that unanswered. His own wife had died much the same way, taken in a raid by men who thought the frontier gave them rights it didn't. He followed the trail through pine and ice, his Mustang pushing through knee-deep drifts, and every mile he grew angrier. Evelyn, meanwhile, endured the trip with clenched teeth, hiding her fear behind narrowed eyes. When Clay questioned her, she pretended not to understand. When he struck her again, she whispered that he'd never find the gold because her husband hadn't trusted anyone, not even her. That lie kept her alive another day. The camp they made at night was crude, just a fire ring and some bedrolls tossed down near frozen creek beds, but Evelyn studied every inch. She noticed Clay always put his rifle to the left of his saddle. She noticed the youngest outlaw, Jesse, had a limp and hesitated before answering orders. She stored all this away. On the 3rd night, she made a break for it, smashing a lantern over a sleeping outlaw's head and sprinting through snow-covered brush. Her bare feet bled, but she made it nearly half a mile before Clay's shot whistled past her ear, and then a second cracked in her thigh. She fell screaming, face first in the snow, and was dragged back, sobbing and cold. Clay held his pistol to her head and told her the next time she tried that, she'd be left for the wolves. Evelyn looked him in the eyes and told him she'd rather die free than live as his prisoner. Boone found their trail again at dawn, following broken branches and blood speckles until he reached the remains of the fire. He knelt and touched the snow, still warm beneath the ash, and whispered, "I'm close." Boone didn't believe in God anymore, but he believed in justice, and in that moment, it was holy. He moved fast, taking higher ground, cutting them off by riding hard across the western ridge. From there, he could see them in the valley, a woman draped across a horse, unmoving. His stomach twisted. Boone readied his long rifle and took aim, steadying his breath like he had 1,000 times before. The first shot struck the outlaw at the rear of the group, clean through the neck. The second dropped the one leading Evelyn's horse. Chaos broke out, gunfire echoing through the mountains, but Boone had already moved, slipping down the hill like a shadow. Evelyn seized the moment. She yanked the reins of her horse and kicked, bolting toward the trees, though every jolt sent fire through her thigh. Clay screamed for his men to regroup, but Boone was already among them, a ghost in a duster, his revolver flashing. When he reached Evelyn, she collapsed into his arms, and he barely caught her before she hit the snow. Her face was gray, her lips blue, but her eyes flickered open. "You came," she whispered, and Boone, kneeling in the bloodied snow, held her against his chest and whispered, "You're safe now. I swear it." Boone carried her to a cave he'd used before, a small hollow in the granite wall hidden behind a curtain of icicles. He cleaned her wound with melted snow and whiskey, wrapped it with cloth torn from his own shirt, and built a fire that glowed like a promise. Evelyn drifted in and out of sleep, her fever burning, but every time her eyes opened, Boone was there. She asked who he was, and when he said, "Just a man who hates men like Clay," she smiled despite the pain. That night, the wind howled like wolves circling the mountain, but inside the cave, Evelyn and Boone were quiet. He told her about his wife, how he'd buried her under a cottonwood tree and never gone back. She told him how she used to sing to her chickens because it kept the silence from swallowing her whole. He listened. She smiled. And somewhere in that cold, blood-stained cave, two broken people began to feel whole again. Clay Maddox wasn't dead. Not yet. He'd fled with Jesse into the trees, swearing vengeance. Evelyn and Boone knew he'd come back, and that the fight wasn't over. But as Boone cradled her beside the fire, his calloused hand resting over hers, he knew what he was willing to fight for now. He'd spent years with no home, no cause, and no reason to believe in anything. But this woman, this fire, this heartbeat under his palm, it was more than enough. Evelyn looked up at him, pain in her eyes, and said, "You didn't have to come." Boone stared back and said, "Maybe not, but I did, and I'm not leaving without you." Outside, the storm screamed through the pines, but inside, there was silence, solid, unbroken, and full of something neither of them had felt in years. Hope. The wind screamed through the canyon like a banshee, tearing at the cowboy's duster as he trudged through the waist-deep snow, eyes fixed on the faint trail of boot prints half buried in white. His name was Jesse Colt, a name whispered with fear in saloons and camps from Montana to New Mexico, a man with a past too bloodstained to wash clean. But now, all that mattered was the woman, Eleanor, taken again by the same men who'd once left her for dead in the mountain cabin. She had barely begun to heal when Jesse left her by the fire to hunt for food. He'd only been gone an hour. That was all they'd needed. The signs of a struggle were burned into the snow. Scuff marks, drops of blood, the outline of a rifle, but in the slush. He'd tracked them for 3 days now, deeper into the Rockies, his rage burning hotter than the freezing wind. Jesse was a man who didn't make promises, but when he looked into her eyes that night in the cave, he knew he'd die before letting them touch her again. Each footfall was agony, each breath a razor down his throat. But Jesse didn't slow. He remembered her hands, small, trembling, brushing against his chest as he wrapped her in a blanket. Her voice when she asked why he'd saved her. He hadn't answered then because he didn't know. But now he did. She was more than a stranger in need. She was the first soul he'd ever wanted to protect, not for honor or redemption, but because he couldn't bear the world without her. Ahead, a curl of smoke marked the raiders' camp. Jesse dropped to his belly, crawling like a wolf, the butt of his rifle cold against his cheek. 4 of them, drunk, laughing, one tossing something shiny, her necklace, into the air. The sight flipped a switch in Jesse. No longer a man, just instinct. He rose with a predator's grace, stepped from the trees, and fired once, twice, 3 times. The first 2 fell before they knew they were hunted. The third ran and caught a bullet between the shoulder blades. The last one, big, scarred, and once the leader grabbed Eleanor, dragging her into the tent. Jesse didn't hesitate. He charged through snow, ice, and bullets, shoulder crashing through canvas like a bull. The scarred man slashed at him with a knife. Jesse caught the blade in his forearm, pain like fire blooming through muscle, but his other hand drove the butt of his rifle into the man's face again and again until nothing moved but blood dripping in the silence. Eleanor lay on the floor, her dress torn, bruises blooming beneath her eyes. She looked up, dazed, and whispered, "You came." He dropped to his knees beside her, cradling her like glass, brushing her hair back with a hand that had ended men's lives. "Ain't nowhere else I'd be." She cried then, not from pain, but from something deeper. Relief. Safety. Jesse wrapped her in his coat and pulled her into the shelter of his arms, her head on his chest, heart pounding against his ribs. For the first time in years, his hands shook, not from cold, not from rage, but from holding something precious. They moved slow the next morning, Jesse half carrying her as they hiked down the slope. The snow was turning to slush, the storm fading, and birds had begun to sing again. She was quiet, but not broken. Jesse told her stories as they walked, of cattle drives, of Mexican deserts, of a time he tried to settle down once in Wyoming. She laughed once, soft and sad, like someone remembering how. He asked if she'd had a home. She said it was gone, burned by the same men he'd buried yesterday. Jesse didn't ask more. Her hands stayed in his, their fingers knotted like roots, as if letting go would kill them both. That night, they reached a tiny lined shack nestled near Frozen Creek. Jesse built a fire, cooked beans, then stitched his own wound by lamplight, grunting as the needle pierced flesh. She sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest, and when he faltered from pain, she pressed her hand over his. "You saved me again," she whispered. Jesse looked into her eyes, stormy, haunted, and beautiful, and something inside him cracked. "You ain't just someone I saved," he said hoarsely. "You're someone I want to keep safe. Always." Eleanor cried then, not from fear, but because it was the first time since her husband's murder that someone had looked at her like she mattered. Jesse reached for her, gently, like she was a sunrise he was afraid to touch. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed his brow, his cheek, the corner of his mouth. Their lips met softly, not with lust, but with longing. Two broken people, searching for warmth in a world that had only ever given them frostbite. They fell asleep in each other's arms, not as lovers, not yet, but as survivors who found something rare in the mountains, peace. Jesse stayed awake for a long time, watching the fire, her head on his shoulder, her breath warm against his collarbone. He thought of the men he'd killed, of the life he'd led, of how none of it mattered anymore. The only thing real was the woman in his arms. For the first time, Jesse dreamed, not of gunfire or gallows, but of a ranch with a white fence and Eleanor barefoot in the grass, smiling like morning. In the days that followed, they traveled slowly down the mountain, Jesse teaching her to shoot, to ride again, to feel strong in her own skin. She began to smile more often. The bruises faded, but Jesse knew the real wounds were beneath the surface. He never pushed her, never asked what they did to her when they took her. He just held her when she woke from nightmares and told her he wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, while they rested by a stream, she looked at him and said, "You're not the man they say you are." Jesse didn't answer, just stared at the water. "You're better," she added. He shook his head. "I ain't better, but I'm trying. For you." That night, she came to him by the fire and kissed him without hesitation. This time, they didn't stop. And when it was over, they lay tangled in blankets and sweat, the cold forgotten, their hearts thundering with something neither had felt in years, hope. The mountain, once cruel and cold, became their sanctuary. Jesse built a new cabin at the edge of the tree line, strong and simple. Eleanor painted the shutters blue. She planted wildflowers. They hunted together, worked side by side, and each day, the shadows in their eyes grew lighter. Word spread through nearby towns of a dangerous man living in the hills, but those who came to find trouble never returned. Jesse was still a killer, but now his guns serve a purpose, protecting the only person who ever made him believe he was worth redemption. And Eleanor? She was no longer the widow in mourning. She became something fierce and gentle, a wildflower that grew from blood and frost. And every time Jesse looked at her, he knew he didn't just save her. She saved him too. Spring crept in slowly through the mountains, like a promise whispered after a long silence. The snow melted in rivulets that ran down into the valley, carving paths through the forest, feeding streams, and carrying away the bloodstains of a violent winter. In the little log cabin Jesse had built, life began anew, not just in the way the trees bloomed or the deer came to graze again, but in the way Eleanor laughed without fear and slept without screaming. Jesse watched her from the porch sometimes, hands curled around a mug of coffee, his face still cut from past battles but softer now, gentled by peace he never thought he'd live to find. She walked barefoot through the grass in a faded blue dress, her hair longer now, her smile a sunrise he never tired of. And though he never said it, Jesse knew what he was looking at. Not just the woman he'd saved, but the future he never thought he deserved. They had fallen into rhythm. Not a perfect one, but a quiet, healing kind of rhythm that neither wanted to break. Jesse chopped wood and hunted game. Eleanor tended the small garden and tried her hand at baking, often failing and laughing anyway. He didn't mind the burnt biscuits. He minded the way her hands shook sometimes when he came home late, even if it was just from the river. But every time, he'd pull her close and remind her with his arms that he wasn't gone for good. Her trauma still haunted her, but it was a ghost fading in the light of new days. They slept wrapped in each other, the silence of the mountains broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote or the crackle of the fire. Jesse rarely dreamed anymore. When he did, it was of her. Eleanor, standing on the porch of their cabin, belly round with child, smiling like she'd never known sorrow. That image became reality sooner than either of them expected. One morning, Eleanor came out of the cabin holding a tin cup of coffee and said, "I think I'm pregnant." Jesse dropped his axe. Just like that. It clanged against a stump, but neither of them looked down. He stared at her for a long moment, then crossed the yard and took her face in his hands, pressing his forehead to hers. "We'll make it," he whispered. "You, me, and the little one." Her tears soaked into his shirt, but this time they were tears of joy. They started preparing the cabin for winter early, building a second room, reinforcing the roof. Jesse traveled down the mountain to trade for supplies, blankets, food, even a cradle carved by a man who owed him a favor from a long time ago. When he returned, Eleanor clutched the little wooden cradle like it was treasure. The pregnancy grounded them. It made everything real. Jesse began to talk about the future more, about teaching the child to ride, to shoot, to read. Eleanor said she wanted a girl. Jesse didn't care, boy or girl, as long as they were strong and kind and safe. But the peace they'd built wasn't meant to go unchallenged. One August afternoon, a posse rode up the trail, a sheriff and 2 deputies from a nearby county. They came asking for Jesse by name. Old warrants, murder, robbery, retribution. Jesse didn't run. He stepped onto the porch, rifle slung across his shoulder, and told Eleanor to stay inside. The sheriff was younger than Jesse, bold but cautious. He asked Jesse to come down and surrender. Jesse didn't. Instead, he told the story of the men who took Eleanor, of what he did to get her back, of the life they'd built. "You can hang me," Jesse said, "but I ain't leaving her alone up here." The sheriff looked past him at Eleanor, standing in the doorway, one hand resting protectively over her belly. And he made a choice. "You've done enough," he said. "Keep your head low. You're not wanted here anymore." Jesse didn't thank him. He just nodded, and the posse turned around. That night, Eleanor couldn't stop shaking. "They could have taken you," she whispered. "They didn't," he said, holding her close. "Not this time." And something shifted in him like a lock turning. That night, under the stars and beside their fire, he pulled a ring from the leather pouch around his neck. It wasn't new. It had belonged to his mother. "I want you to be my wife," he said, voice thick with dust and emotion. "Not just in this cabin. In every way a man can ask." Eleanor didn't speak. She just slid the ring on her finger and kissed him so deeply the fire popped like it couldn't handle the heat. They were married the next day with no preacher, just vows whispered beneath the trees and promises made with hands over hearts. From that moment, she was Eleanor Colt. Winter returned, this time not as an enemy, but as a season of warmth wrapped in furs, candles glowing behind frosted glass, and the sound of Eleanor humming lullabies while she knitted beside the fire. Jesse read aloud from an old book they'd found, one of the only things salvaged from her old home. And when the baby came, she came fast and screaming and healthy. A girl. Eleanor wept, holding her daughter to her chest, and Jesse just sat beside them, tears running down his weathered cheeks, whispering the name they'd chosen, Rose. They raised her with the quiet strength of people who had known loss, taught her early that love was a kind of armor stronger than any gun. Jesse taught her to ride when she could barely hold the reins. Eleanor taught her to read by candlelight, smiling when the girl traced each word with wonder. The years passed, and the cabin became a home. Jesse built a swing in the yard, repaired a second cabin nearby for when Rose got older. Sometimes, men still came to the mountains looking for the outlaw Jesse used to be, but they never made it far. Jesse wasn't hiding. He was simply living, and those who tried to take that away quickly learned what it meant to cross a man with nothing left to lose but everything he loved. And Eleanor? She became the soul of that place. The mountain itself seemed to bend around her. She planted a garden that bloomed every spring, nursed animals back to health, welcomed strangers with tea, but kept a rifle behind the door. She was soft but never weak, gentle but forged by fire. And Jesse loved her more with every passing day. Loved her in the way he chopped wood, in the way he kissed her hand when he came in from the cold, in the way he still looked at her like she was the first sunrise after a lifetime of storms. Their love wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect, but it was deep and unshakable, born in blood and healed by kindness. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and their daughter chased fireflies across the yard, Jesse pulled Eleanor close on the porch and whispered, "You were never just something I saved. You're everything I needed to live."